opportunity to ventilate these issues constitutionally. In my view, some of these things could more readily be ventilated privately or democratically through legislation, but that's my curmudgeonly, grumpy perspective.
It seems to me that even though we are talking about the church and state as somehow equal entities in this sort of dispute, or I wouldn't even, not necessarily a dispute, but in this relationship, it is the role of the state to circumscribe the role of the church to a great degree in public life, in that it is creating the laws and that sort of thing. And so it seems that there is a need for the state to make room for the church in any sort of litigation, any sort of law, and that sort of thing. In the schools, which I would argue are becoming increasingly, playing an increasingly large role in the socialization of kids and in general, any withdrawal or any removal of any sort of religious, I would almost say religious support for students would be seen as an implication that there is something wrong with religion by the students, and therefore is propagating, not merely protecting, but propagating an atheist perspective. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah. As to the premises, I think you're quite right. The state does set rules for the church, and the expression of the church's both individual and corporate life have to be regulated by law. The church is not a law unto itself. It can't be a law unto itself. It has to abide by tax and zoning and employment law and all the other things. It does not have the power of life and limb that the state has through the coercive power of the sword. The church or religious bodies cannot be in the business of engaging in torts or in crimes, cannot be battering or assaulting, cannot be raping or killing, cannot be jeopardizing life. All of those are activities which the state, through our Constitution and through the social contract that informs the Constitution, has as its sole prerogative. And so the church has to be recognized that it is circumscribed, and you're quite right. It doesn't follow naturally from that as a consequence the state is doing something necessarily untoward in keeping religion out of the public school. It's a different beast. There's actually a quid pro quo arrangement, because what has happened is the public school has been largely devoid of religious content, but the alternative side is that private religious schools are permitted to exist, to be accredited, and to have free exercise protection to do things in their own unique religious way with no interference by the state, and sometimes with support by the state. And so the ideal is you got private religious education, you have home education, you have education in your school or your shul or your synagogue or your mosque or your church or your catechism room, and you, if you choose to use the public school, have a form of education there. And that form of education has now been, through 40 years of case law, been largely de-religionized. And here's the argument that the court crafted from the 40s to the 80s, and then we'll talk about whether the logic still works. The court said, look, the public school is an arm of the state. In many communities, the most visible arm of the state. The public school exists as a model and a medium of democracy. It is the best example that we have of direct democracy, school officials representing the state, interacting with parents and with kids in a very direct way through school boards and the like. And the school is there to teach the next generation the basic values of the American democratic experiment. Teach them democratic values. That's what the public school movement was initially articulated to do. Among the values we want to impart are constitutional values, and more particularly the values of the First Amendment Establishment Clause, which we, the courts say, means separation of church and state. Kids are required to go to school. Mandatory school attendance laws in every state. And kids are young and impressionable and can't make discerning, mature choices, at least on the ground in the school when parents and siblings are gone. And so just because of that, because it's a state actor, because it's teaching democratic values, including separationist values, because the kids are young and impressionable, because they are required to be there. Here in the public school, if nowhere else in public life, we're going to be vigilant about keeping religion out as a sectarian influence. No religious texts, no religious teachers, no religious symbols, no prayers, no Bible reading, no moments of silence, nothing. We're going to simply bleach the school of any religious content. And why was that? The court saw that for 40 years as a necessary way to ensure an alternative transmission of democratic values different from the transmission of democratic values a person would acquire in the accredited religious school of which he or she was perfectly entitled to go. Now the question becomes, has it worked? And it's no insult, I think, to the public school movement. Iowa's a notable exception, I know. No insult to the public school movement to say that in many cities and in many states it's failed miserably. And the question then becomes, why has it failed? And how can it be fixed? And there is plenty of argumentation to be made that you're leaving an ally who could be very helpful to you, namely the religious community, out of the possible solution. And so we've slowly begun to move toward, well, let's draw that ally in. How do we do that? Well, we have these voluntary programs, after school hours, that students can participate in. If outside religious folk want to come in and teach kids values, great. As long as it's voluntary, as long as it's after school hours, as long as kids know that they don't have to be there, great. Zellman case says, well, how about vouchers? Maybe we can give kids a get out of jail free card. Right? Let's get out of this crazy public school in Cleveland. It's ridiculous. You know, kids are raped, kids are killed, kids get on drugs, they walk out pregnant. 82% of them by the 10th grade have had sex at least 10 times. You want your kid to go there? If you're dirt poor, you have no choice. And so what does Cleveland say? Here's a chance for you to go out. And you can go to a private school, religious or non-religious, in a voucher. Take your kid out and move him or her. And the religious schools and the other private schools who are non-religious say, and we'll take them for whatever you guys want to give us at the state, which turns out to be about a quarter of the tuition rate they otherwise would charge. And we'll keep a seat in the class for Joey and for Betty to sit there. That also has been upheld. And slowly what's happening is, through these means, religion and religious communities, alongside other support networks, are being brought in to help the amelioration of chronically failing public schools. Is that a good thing? I think the bottom result is good. Are there alternative ways? I think we're at a very early stage of experimenting. Something needs to be done.
I'm just thinking that you have two alternatives. One is to take all religion out, or to include it in a conversation. Why have we chosen to, in public, include a conversation in school?
And the argument so far, which has been sufficient for the federal courts, has been because kids are too young and impressionable. They can't make they can't discern amongst the various perspectives that are going to be taught there. And invariably, when you allow that into the public school, the student is going to be hostage to the religious perspective of his or her teacher. And God forbid, that might be a Catholic, or a Lutheran, or a Mormon, or a Muslim, or a Jew. And we don't want to have that. And that's the worry that a lot of people bring to the table when they say, we really don't want this stuff. Okay?
I have 3 more hands, and we'll see if we can get to them and wrap up soon.
What do you see for the future of teaching intelligent design or creationism in schools, especially with President Bush's recent proposal of implementing it into curriculum?
It's certainly going to be the hot issue for a while, and I guess the issue is whether it is intelligent design or creationism, or intelligent design and creationism. Whether intelligent design is something different from a new form of science, or whether it's simply a retranslation of traditional creation science. If it's a mere translation or new form of creation science, it does not stand much of a chance of being injected into the science curriculum of the public school. The Supreme Court has spoken very forcefully to that issue twice, in Epperson versus Arkansas in 1968 and Edwards v. Aguillard in 1987, and the court has said both times, sorry, no privileging as a science of a theory of creation predicated upon religious sources. The hard issue is going to be whether intelligent design is something different, draws better scientific evidence into the discussion, sheds some of the more overt theological premises that creation science historically had in place, and will be upheld by respected scientists as a viable alternative theory to other theories of origins, the various kinds of evolutionary theories that are out there. For example, is this going to be kind of a new spin on the old phylogenetic theories of evolution, where the notion was you have phyla that are in place, and those basic phyla are there, and the jumps from phylum to phylum are the hard ones. That's the missing links all the time. But the phyla are there, which have all manner of evolution in them. That's an old 60s and 70s style of evolutionary theory that got discarded fairly quickly, but actually is a bit of a scientific analog to some of the arguments, at least, of intelligent design. If more of that kind of argumentation comes to the table and self-respecting scientists step up to say, we embrace this as a viable way of thinking, at least in part about theories of origins, is appropriate. The other way by which intelligent design proponents will find their way into the public school classroom is to simply use what has been the wide open door that the court has left since 1963 in the Schempp case, where the court said that religion can be taught as an object of history, as an artifact of history, of literature, of poetry. You can't teach it for its value to try to proselytize a person into the faith, but there's nothing wrong with talking about the Puritans in the history of Massachusetts Bay, or talking about the Jews in the Holocaust, or talking about the importance of Judaism to the modern state of Israel, or talking about the African American religious communities that existed before the Civil War among the slave population. Nothing wrong with that. These historical facts can be taught. And you can also put it into literature courses and poetry courses and art courses and the like. And then the question becomes then, especially in a high school context, whether a theory of intelligent design would more aptly be included in a 10th or 11th grade course in anthropology or cosmology or philosophy. And the story can then be told in warts and all, with no pretense about science or non-science, but simply say that there are a variety of theories of origins. Here are 8 of them. And one of them is set out in this book called Genesis. In 1 and 2, 2 different versions. And here are some of the evidences with respect to that formulation. And here are some of the communities that believe in that stuff. It's very interesting. Now let's move on to Etruscan literature. There's nothing wrong with teaching it that way. And then if I had to make a guess, I would say that attempt for intelligent design, unless it's got a lot more scientific bells and whistles to it than I have seen described so far, the attempts to put that into the science curriculum are going to go nowhere. The attempts to put it in through cosmology and other kinds of courses is more probable. And the big caveat is going to be, is the Supreme Court and the federal courts going to get out of the business of testing these things under the Establishment Clause, which is another issue we could talk about. It's that third or fourth form of separation of church and state that's getting a little traction these days.
Well, thank you for a fine lecture, Dr. Witte. Very enjoyable. We've been talking about religion and state, of course. It would be very difficult, I think, for somebody running for public office not to have some kind of a religious connection. And I'm wondering, do we have laws, or do we have adequate laws that protect the rights of people who are not religious?
Certainly in the political office context we do. We have prohibitions against religious test oaths being administered. And while those provisions in both the federal constitution and in state constitutions are largely dead letters today, those could be easily resurrected, and they could be expounded into various kinds of checks against the screens that might be formally or informally imposed, even in initial ballots and in conventions and the like. So those kind of protections are there. And the court has, especially in the last 20 years or so, in free speech and free exercise, been very zealous about protecting religion and non-religion equally. And that there are people that have no professed religious beliefs who deserve the same protection of those who have professed religious beliefs. And especially the left wing of the court, Justice Souter in particular, has been pressing the same logic under the Establishment Clause and insisting that what the Establishment Clause really does is require government to be neutral, both amongst religions and between religion and non-religion, and to violate either one, to show preference for one religion over another, or to show preference for religion over non-religion, is to engage in a constitutional violation. So there is ample protection for the secular, and for the non-religious, and for the anti-religious in this country. And people will fight very strongly, including the Christian Legal Society, for the right of the secularist to have his or her voice heard.
I was a bit surprised to hear you lump together under the category of relatively trivial concerns about separation. The coming to my door of, say, some Jehovah's Witnesses, and you pointed out I can always close the door on them, which I don't do. And the presence on, let's say, local government property of a cross, which you suggest I can shut out by closing my eyes. I wonder if that doesn't rather miss the point. I can certainly dismiss the Jehovah's Witnesses without further worry, but my having my eyes open or closed, it seems to me, is irrelevant to the kind of worry that people have about the presence of the cross, which might, to a reasonable person, suggest that the local government is telegraphing the message that they are in some way operating from the premises of a particular religious tradition, or at the very least that they are attempting to curry favor from a part of the population that represents a particular religious tradition, as opposed to suggesting an equal responsibility to other parts of the population. Right. Whether I keep my eyes closed or open doesn't affect that at all.
A few different points. First of all, with respect to Jehovah's Witness showing up on your doorstep, if you put a no trespassing sign, no trespassing at all, or no Jehovah's Witnesses thank you, or no Bible thumpers thank you, the moment somebody trespasses on your property after seeing that sign, they've engaged in criminal conduct, criminal trespass, and they could be prosecuted for their conduct. So you have a voluntary self-protection there. That's important. That involves the use of the state. The notion that you can then carry that privacy analogy a little bit further is to play with the image of you carry your privacy bubble with you wherever you go. You have a privacy bubble that you can continue to insist upon in the public square that doesn't go to the metes and bounds of your property, but nonetheless provides you with ways of averting offensive religious and non-religious speech that you don't wish to hear. And yes, the notion is that when it's government speech as opposed to private speech, there is a difference in case. I understand that entirely. What I'm trying to focus on is that privacy capacity that you have, that virtual frontier as I called it, is a virtual frontier that you need to exercise on your own a little bit more regularly rather than use the federal courts. Now, the premise of that is that if that government's got a series of symbols, then there are all kinds of symbols out there. If the only thing on the government property is a crucifix, occupied or non-occupied, I've got a big problem. But if you have a cacophony of different symbols out there, one of which happens to be religious, and the government is supporting it or allowing it or subsidizing it, my argument is that you can't, we shouldn't use, I can't say you can't, but you shouldn't use the Establishment Clause as the first vehicle for exercising your disdain, your rejection of government depiction of that symbol. Go to the legislature, avoid using it, participating in it, seeing in it would be a better recourse. That's my argument. And it's to dampen the enthusiasm for the federal case. on things that, in my judgment, are not steps along the way pointing toward or respecting an establishment of religion. But you and I probably disagree about that, which is fine.
Well, the questions have gone on for centuries and millennia, so I'm sure they could continue for a few more hours here tonight. But we would like to wrap up. Again, please, if you would give your evaluations to the ushers as you go out to help us in planning future events. And again, let's express our thanks to Dr. Witte and invite him to come back to Iowa again.